Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Wednesday night Hump Day Hanger presentation sponsored by supercub.org and the Not So Straight and Level podcast. Before I talk about much else and our speaker this evening, I want to tell you a little bit about, we have a new landing page, well, sort of newly updated landing page for the Hump Day Hanger presentations because we've been having so many of them. I wanted a little better way to kind of centralize the information about them. So if you go to the supercub.org homepage, at the top, there's a picture with some camels in it. If you click that, it'll take you to the new landing page, which has all of the old presentations, all of them that have been streamed and put on YouTube. You can watch anytime, and the upcoming presentations, things that are happening in the next few weeks. And we've got some good ones coming up that I think you'll enjoy. Next week, George Campbell will be with us again. George is going to be talking about float flying in Alaska and some of those exciting things they do up there on floats. So tonight, as in times past, you're going to use the chat function to ask any questions. You can do that on YouTube. You can use the chat function on YouTube or the chat function on Zoom to ask questions. We're going to ask, though, because Amy, that's presenting tonight, is a very organized presenter, and most likely she will answer your questions sometime in her presentation. So we're going to hold questions until the end, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask Amy some questions. So tonight's guest, Amy Hoover, I'm not going to say a lot about her because she's going to do a good job of introducing herself, but certainly to say she's a big name in backcountry, and I think you're in for an enjoyable evening. Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Steve. We're ready to go. Well, as Steve mentioned, my name's Amy Hoover, and some of you may be wondering who the heck that is. And so I'll give you a little bit of background about how I ended up here in mountain canyon flying. It's kind of a circuitous path. I actually didn't start out to fly airplanes. I didn't even start flying till I was in my late 20s. I was a geologist. In fact, I was at Oregon State University in geology, and that's how I got to Idaho. I moved to Idaho in 1984 while I was working on my master's thesis in geology and also doing a little work for the U.S. Geological Survey. Of course, when I graduated with a master's degree in geology, there were no jobs. So what I did was get a job on the river. And this is important because I became a river guide on the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, which is in the middle of the Frank Church Wilderness. And in low water years, all of these big heavy boats that you see here that we're rowing around with all this junk, in the low water years, we can't get to the boat ramp at the top of the river. So my first ride in a little airplane was in a Britain Norman Islander, like the one here, piled up with all the river gear going into the river, because in the low water, that's how we have to get there. And oh my gosh, that was incredible. It was my first airplane ride in a little airplane down into these canyons, landing at a little strip. And I thought, well, I just have to do this. So took a big left turn in my life. Fortunately, river guiding at the time, I could make enough money to pay for my flight training. And then in the winters, I actually fled to Baja, California, and I was a sea kayaking guide. And this is my friend Ricardo, who still has a business down there. We were guiding together. And then we'd go over to Magdalena Bay and we would do whale watching trips. And I worked as a guide and a naturalist there. So the point being, I was able to make enough money basically in the winter and the summer to pay for all my flight training. And this was the coolest part of the story. I got my pilot's license in Salmon, Idaho in 1989. And I immediately bought a little Cessna 120. This is Victor, my little airplane. This is one of the few pictures I actually have of it. And that little airplane was what basically taught me a lot of things about mountain and canyon flying, because I was flying in the backcountry in this tiny little airplane. And I had to basically learn how to read the wind and the weather and operate in low power at high density altitudes. And so that was a really fun thing. I also flew it to Florida in the middle of the winter one time, and back up through the Appalachians, where I'm from, in West Virginia, and then back to Idaho. So that little airplane taught me a lot. So after I, built, probably had about 800 or 900 hours by the time I got my first job as an air taxi pilot. So back to flying the bigger airplanes and flying in the mountain and canyon areas there in the Idaho backcountry. And then in the early 90s, I got my flight instructor certificate and started teaching mountain flying seminars for the FAA. And that was over in Chalice, Idaho, actually, trying to get everybody out of there. And I did a little stint as a corporate pilot. I flew a Beech Duke for a little while and a Mitsubishi MU2. The company I was flying for, right after I stopped flying for them, bought a Citation, which is too bad. I didn't get any jet time. But during that time, I was flying the backcountry and teaching the mountain flying. And my friend Lynn Clark, who some of you older people may have known Lynn, but she called me up and she said, I think us girls ought to do this mountain canyon flying stuff. So this was the year that we started the McCall Mountain Canyon Flying Seminars. And that's actually Lynn right there. And Lori and I, that was the first year we started the seminars out there in McCall. Unfortunately, Lynn died about probably a week or two after that picture was taken. But we continued on, and I stayed there for about 4 or 5 years and worked on the curriculum and teaching, et cetera. But I really wanted to go into teaching more full-time instead of just a summer gig. So I started my PhD back at Oregon State University, where I had done my master's. And during that time, I was the director at Mount Hood Community College, director of the aviation program. And then I landed here at Central Washington University about, well, this is my 19th year. So that's basically how I got into both instructing and the mountain canyon flying background. You'll still find me right here in the summers. Amarillo, not exactly right there, but that's one of the places. But I'm always back in Idaho in the summers, flying in the backcountry. I have a small business called Canyon Flying. That's my little flying buddy over there on the side. And I still do a little bit of backcountry instruction. I don't do the full-blown seminars anymore. What I actually like to do is just have a client come and we spend 3 or 4 days together, just one-on-one. They come in their airplane and then we can do it a little more relaxed and get out of the airplane and, you know, do some things and stop at the backcountry ranches and take a walk, etc. You can find a little bit more about that on canyonflying.com, which is my website. I've got some articles on there that I've written over the years. And then, of course, when Dick and I got together, we had this book coming out. Now, I realized this is a supercub.org site. So I was talking to Dick a couple of days ago. I said, well, I better show a picture of a super cub here. So there's a super cub. That's actually Dick Williams' super cub. And that's Dick and I in our survival vest. That's actually the picture that's on the back of our book. This is the book here. It's Mountain, Canyon, and Backcountry Flying, if you haven't seen it. And we had a lot of fun doing it. It's a lot of work. Probably spent, oh gosh, almost 2 years full time working on it. Of course, there's a lot of background before that. And I had been teaching university courses and publishing, and Dick's written a lot of things. Dick actually started the first backcountry flying school in Idaho back in the 80s. So I think it worked out pretty well. What I'm going to do now is give you a little bit of tidbits out of the book. It's not a super cub. Sorry, I had to get equal representation here. So interestingly, the book is full of a whole lot of things that, you know, we can't do in an hour. So I decided to pick the subject that a lot of people find the least interesting, if that makes any sense, because there's a lot of other things we could talk about, but I find the whole concept of weather and how it interacts in the mountainous terrain and canyon terrain fascinating. And it's not just weather. What I'm going to kind of work with you here today is how that weather will affect your decision-making and your flight operations in this unique environment. And I think people are kind of still rolling in here, so we'll just proceed on. But one of the things I ask people, like I ask my students, what the heck is weather? You know, when we think about it, I mean, you'll think about clouds and rain, precipitation, wind. Heat is another one. You know, in mountain areas, you're often at a high altitude. So when it's hot, your density altitude increases. And so that's part of the weather as well. So let's just start out with some of those. Here is an example. I'm looking out the wing of my airplane on an undercast. That's weather, that's clouds. So the question you might ask is, well, I'm flying over the top of this. Is that risky? Is it dangerous? The answer is, yeah, it could be. You know, that the FAA does a good job in talking about risk management and what the difference between a hazard and a risk is. A hazard is something that is. A hazard is like a thunderstorm or an undercast like this, possibly. The risk is how you interpret it and how you decide to either mitigate that risk do what you can to mitigate it, or to eliminate it, or accept it. And everybody has a different level of risk. They accept different levels of risk based on their own experience, their own proficiency, possibly even how they're feeling that day. So was I taking a risk? Well, yes. In fact, I know what's underneath there. The question is, if you have a problem, what if you had to go down through it? Well, this is what's underneath it, looking off to my right. So I know it's pretty ugly if I were to have a problem. But also, I know as I was coming across there that the airport I left from, only about 10 miles back behind me, was completely clear. And I looked at a webcam at my destination airport, which is only about 20 miles in front of me, and it's completely clear. So that's the way I mitigate the risk in that case, was just say, hey, yeah, I'm flying over this undercast, and it could be kind of, risky if I had to go down through it into that nasty terrain, but I'm willing to fly for 4 or 5 minutes over the top of it and, consider it not to be that much of a risk because I'm going somewhere I know that's clear. Now, here's where it becomes a little more troublesome, possibly. And what this is the same river canyon, but as you can see here, that undercast, and this is a summer day, you get these fog layers, they start to lift up because you get heating from the sun and they start to lift up. Now it's tempting, isn't it? Because you see breaks in the undercast. Well, I'm going to an airstrip down in that canyon. Maybe I can duck under. Maybe I can just duck down in there and fly down that canyon, that ugly looking rocky canyon that I showed you. And is that okay? Well, again, it depends. I mean, if you go underneath it, you're going to get something possibly like this. I was underneath the layer here. Is it risky? Well, it could be. To be honest, I don't fly underneath a solid overcast in a canyon unless I know where I am and I'm really familiar with the area and where I'm going. Because, down around the corner here, what if I got into lower clouds or low visibility? Maybe I couldn't get turned around. And so that's part of that mitigating that risk. And you have to make those decisions. Is that a smart idea? Again, it depends on your experience and your risk, your ability to accept whatever risk you assessed as. If I go to an area that I don't know very well, I'm sure not going to do the same kind of weather conditions that I might in an area that I know really well. So here's an example. This was actually 2 years ago, Christmas Day. I remember it because my friend Mike Doris, who flies the mail route in that area, I went with him to fly it. And the reason we were flying it on Christmas Day is the day before he tried to get in and he just couldn't. But this is that same river. And you can see here, we got that kind of scuddy stuff. And so we really, we can't really go down in there right now. And we flew around, tried a couple other things, came back. It was looking a little better, maybe 10 minutes later or so, but you still got this overcast here and, fog down in the canyon. So we decided, that's not a good idea. We just went up, delivered the mail somewhere else. And then we came back about, probably 35 or 40 minutes later, and the whole thing had cleared up. So that's the point, is a lot of times this weather, and this happens to be in the winter, but it'll move around. And so that's where your fuel planning comes in. Because if you're flying in, and that's part of that risk assessment, if you're flying this type of weather and this type of terrain, you're probably going to have to think about taking more fuel than you might if it's clear, because you might have to fly around for a while. You might have to wait for the weather to clear. You might have to divert. And so maybe you decide to take more fuel. There's that saying that you can't have too much fuel. Well, you can if, for example, it's really hot and high density altitudes. You don't need 9 hours of fuel in your long range tanks to fly for 30 minutes to somewhere, right? It's just, you're adding extra weight. But in this case, maybe you want to double the fuel or triple it or whatever you feel comfortable with. But it is going to factor into your fuel planning. And then even in the summer, this photograph is actually taken in June, so there's still a little snow. But what'll happen is that valley fog might lift up, it'll be broken, and then it'll be right up at ridgetop level. The sun will be beaten down on it, and eventually you'll get cumulus clouds over the tops of the mountain ranges. It'll start to get bumpier because of the solar radiation. And then you can get actually thunderstorms building locally over these mountain ranges. Not only the solar influence for the air mass, but you can get what are called orographic, and we're going to talk about this some more, but orographically produced thunderstorms. So what you get is like these monsoonal rains, monsoonal moisture that'll get pushed by the winds aloft up over a mountain range, create a lot of convective activity, and can build into thunderstorms. So this would be a case where you have an unstable air mass and you're pushing it up a slope and creating these thunderstorms. These things can build really fast, and a lot of times they're not forecast. I've been out in times where all of a sudden you'll just watch this thing build. In fact, I took this shot one day. I was, this is right out of the McCall Airport, and I was with my friend in his hangar. We were going to go do some IFR training, some instrument training. And we came out of the hangar and I looked up and went, oh my gosh, that wasn't there and it wasn't forecast. It's all these mammatus clouds hanging out of basically what's a wall cloud, or a shelf cloud rather, out of the thunderstorm. In fact, this was it. There's the wing of the plane. We were shoving the plane out of the hangar, and all of a sudden all these mammatus clouds. Here's some what's called virga, which is rain that doesn't reach the ground. It evaporates. You don't want to fly around in that stuff regardless of where you are. It's really bumpy and turbulent, but especially in a mountainous environment where you've got the winds producing updrafts and downdrafts, it's just not a good combination. That's one of those where it's a hazard and it's also a high risk, and in my assessment. So I just wouldn't go there. Here's another thing that weather, especially in the Western US, I think actually in the pretty much all over the country at this point, we get nowadays more than we used to 20 or 30 years ago, is smoke. Big areas of smoke from all these forest fires. So here's a question you might ask yourself. This is actually a very large river. It's the Salmon River, and there's a layer of smoke here. Okay, fine. There's an airport, actually. There's a couple airports. There's one right about here down in the canyon. There's another one up that canyon. So what if I want to go down into that airport? Is that something that I'm willing to do? Well, it didn't look too bad. The problem is you can look down into it, but once you start getting down into the smoke and get horizontal visibility, it can be really bad. Here's that same canyon with a lot more smoke in it. And you may be able to see here, you can kind of see down in there. It's legally VFR. It's Class G airspace. So as long as you've got a mile visibility, you're legal under Part 91. Question is it smart? Is that a risk that you're willing to take? You drop down in this canyon and you've got less than a mile horizontal, or a mile to be legal, horizontal visibility. If you're going along at, 90 or 100 or 120 knots, that's only less than half a minute that you've got to see things before you might hit them, right? The other thing that, again, this is actually the South Fork of the Salmon River. That's the Salmon River. There's a lot of smoke down in there. Even though I might say, okay, I know where I am and I can follow the river and come into this strip. What if somebody else is in that canyon? What if they're coming down the canyon? I don't know where they are. They don't know where I am. And now that closure rate, if we're both going 100 to 120 knots with a mile visibility, we'll be right in each other's face before we can even see each other. So smoke is a whole different deal that you really have to think about and say, yeah, is it really worth that risk? So let's talk a little more about some real specific things to canyon weather. Again, I'm going to run this pretty fast paced, but it's, I think, some things you'll find hopefully interesting and maybe give you some things to cogitate and think about. I want to start off with a word I mentioned earlier, which is orographic effects. Then we'll look at solar effects, and then finally some combinations of how those interplay with each other. Orographic just simply means something that's created by air flowing over an obstacle. So this is an example, pretty classic example from the New Zealand group, where you blow a wind over a mountain range. You'll get updrafts, or graphically produced updrafts on the upwind side. You'll get an acceleration over the obstacle, and then you'll get the downdrafts and turbulence on the downwind side. So the point there is, whether it's a large scale or a smaller scale feature, you really don't want to be right here. You don't want to be in the turbulence and downdrafts. You want to try to stay in the updrafts or avoid it altogether. If you're just going to fly over the top of it, then get up high and go over the top of everything. Of course, then that goes back to your fuel planning, because maybe you got a weather winds aloft forecast here and one here at a station. That doesn't really give you information about how you can have higher winds over the top of the terrain. So again, when you're fuel planning and you see this kind of situation where you have winds aloft over a mountain range like this, just plan on it taking a little longer if you're going this way. Now, if you're going this way, you got a nice tailwind, but taking a little longer and adding enough fuel to give yourself a margin of safety. So I mentioned the downdrafts on the downwind side, and this is an interesting little exercise because people think, oh, yeah, it's not that big a deal. For example, if the winds aloft are 25 knots at 12,000 feet, well, let's take a look at that. Here's a very distinct mountain. It's Mount Hood in Oregon, which is a volcanic cone. And there's an excellent book on aviation weather. Actually, I use it when I teach weather classes at the university by Peter Lester. It's put out by Jeppesen. If you haven't seen it, it's a great book. But he has a little formula. I'm not going to bore you with the formula, but basically you can get in there and see it. What I did was used his formula. And if you have a nice clean feature like Mount Hood here, and you blow a wind over it, you can calculate what the downdrafts are going to be. In this case, only 25 knots of wind, which at 12,000 feet, because you can see Mount Hood is up at 11 something. That's not a lot of wind at 12,000 feet, but guess what? You can produce downdrafts that are more than 2,000 feet a minute just by blowing that not very high wind over that mountain. Of course, the gliders love this side because they got the big updrafts. But the point being, there's no way that you're going to outclimb that in a general aviation aircraft. It's not going to happen. So the key there is if you look at the winds aloft and you see even something that doesn't look that bad, 25 knots at that high an altitude, you don't want to be right here on this downwind side. If you do get into some kind of downdraft, the worst thing you can do in a GA aircraft is try to outclimb it because you're not going to. So what you want to do is do what the glider pilots do. Probably are some glider pilots here, is just turn away. They have what they call max penetration speed. You put your nose down, get some speed, get out of that downdraft, turn away from it, and don't even mess with it. Don't try to outclimb it. Now, I looked earlier at the thunderstorms, orographically produced thunderstorms, and I said, that's like if you have unstable air. If you have stable air, which is shown like in this situation, you blow stable air over a mountain range. That's the classic mountain wave situation where, again, you get the updrafts, you get downdrafts and turbulence, and then the stable air will set up this wave condition. If there's no moisture, you really won't be able to see these features, but even if there's a little moisture, you'll see these altocumulus standing lenticulars. You might even see cirrocumulus standing lenticulars. This would be up around the tropopause if you'd see them that high. And so that's a way you can look up into the sky and say, oh, I see these kind of features. If you see a cap cloud, this is called a cap cloud, over the top of the mountain, and you're standing on the ground and it's calm, well, then there's probably going to be turbulence and wind shear heading up that way. In fact, there's going to be turbulence and wind shear if you see these kind of features aloft, because you're going to have to climb through a shear zone to get up there. Now, this is an example. The reason I like to include this, I took this probably 25 years ago out of the window of my Cessna 180. That was way before all the fancy cameras and iPhones and stuff that we have now. It was just a crummy little first generation digital camera. This is Mount Adams in the Oregon Cascades. Beautiful cap cloud over that mountain. You can see though, this is my window of my airplane. I didn't have a zoom or anything. How the heck was I able to get that close up to that cloud without a problem? And the answer is, I just went on the upwind side. I didn't mess around down that downwind side. So the key there is being able to read what the weather's going to do and the wind. And I remember I used to take my river guide friends flying, and they were really good at it because it's like reading whitewater, right? They were used to reading whitewater and running whitewater rivers. So building that skill is really important, actually. So I'll take you on a little example of how you can use it to your advantage. Not just, stay out of the downdraft, but how you can use it to your advantage. This goes back to this is the Sawtooth National Recreation Area in Idaho. It's Stanley is an airport, beautiful little spot. You can see this is a very a linear feature ridge, and it turns out it's pretty much perpendicular to the prevailing winds in the area. They come from kind of the southwest, sometimes south, sometimes west, but generally this area. So you can see what that is. They're going to come over this feature. You're going to have downdrafts and turbulence on this side, probably updrafts over here. Something we're going to talk about a little bit later, a Venturi effect, but just a little foreshadow here. You can see where there's the river, the Salmon River runs through, and creates kind of a notch. And so as these winds come over the mountain, this will actually accelerate them. So this is a really windy airport. It can be with crosswinds and turbulence, etc. This is looking back up at the mountain from the airport. So you can see it's a pretty good drop. And so a funny little story, I was taking off in my Cessna 120 that I showed you earlier one day, and it's a high elevation. So, the density altitude's up there. And a guy took off in front of me in a Cessna 182, and then I took off, and we were both headed back to the same destination, which was over here to the northwest. So he took off, and I heard him call over this lake right here. He said, I'm over the lake at 8,000 feet. So I called right back, and I said, well, I'm over Nippentuck at 10,000, and that's back over here. Well, he knows I'm in this little Cessna 120, right? He said, wait a minute, how'd you do that? He didn't believe me. I said, well, yeah, it's magic. But what happened was he took off and turned this way and was just using his engine power to try to climb out. I took off, whipped it right around, got on right here on the hill, caught an updraft going up 1,000 feet a minute. And by the time I got around here, boom, I was up there. So the point there is you can use your knowledge of these orographic effects to help you. And that's a lot of what I learned from that little airplane. So what I'm going to show you now is a little video. I speeded it up. It's twice as fast as it was when I shot it, so it hopefully it doesn't skip too much. And I'm shooting out the front of my Scout here, just so you can see exactly what I was seeing in the video. Just to set it up a little bit, I'm just left an airport down in a canyon. Got to get up, climb quite a bit, 5,000 or 6,000 feet to get up and over the ridge. The wind at the time was coming from kind of the south. This is a south-facing slope. The wind was coming this way. So I'm going to show you how I use the lift to my advantage and stay out of the downdraft. So here we go. Again, this is speeded up twice as fast. What I'm doing is flying on the side where I know there's going to be these orographic updrafts, okay, and staying right on it. Now, you don't want to get yourself up into one of these little cul-de-sacs. My destination is over that way, but I'm not going to turn up there. Instead, I skip over to the next ridge. I always have a way to turn back. You always want to have an out where you can put your nose down and turn back to lower terrain. But you can see here, I'm just riding the lift. My nose isn't even that high. I'm at just a cruise climb. Instead of going up at 200 or 300 feet a minute under my own engine power, I'm shooting up at 800 or 900 feet a minute. And I just stay right on that lift, on that ridge. It tries to blow you to the downwind side, but don't let it. You got to just keep turning in and stay right on the lift. If it lifts a wing, turn into that wing, because that's where it is. And in fact, I was having so much fun, instead of going to my destination, which is over the right, I thought, well, I'm just going to see how much lift I could get here. And again, I'm just riding that ridge, following the ridge lift, and keeping myself safe by having an out. I can either turn to the left downhill, or now I can turn to the right going downhill. One of the reasons I shoot through the windshield, quite honestly, is to show you all the distractions. Look at all this glare on both sides. It's not within the scope of what we're doing today because we just don't have enough time, but I do have videos and pictures that show, turning into the sun can create so much glare that if you're down in a canyon, it can be really dangerous. Again, so that glare on the windshield can actually be a visual problem. But the lesson there is use the lift to your advantage, know where to find it, go where it is, but have an out to lower terrain and try to stay out of the downdrafts. And that's what we call contour flying or terrain flying. And if people come out to fly with me, we actually spend quite a bit of time doing this because it's not only fun, but I just increase the climb performance on my airplane threefold by using that orographic lift to my advantage. Now, some places it's pretty easy to tell where you're going to find this. For example, this is down in Nevada in the Basin and Range where you get winds blowing out of the west or southwest. Yeah, you're going to have updrafts, downdrafts, updrafts, downdrafts, probably a big mess in between. And you get winds flowing up and down. So, it's a little more straightforward. But you get into some areas, like here in the Idaho backcountry where I spend a lot of time, the rivers go in all directions. You got some flowing south and north and east and west. And you got maybe a winds aloft blowing across it from the south or southwest. And so it's not nearly as obvious as to where you're going to find the up and down drafts, and you get into a more micro scale is what it comes down to. Just like that video I was just showing you where I climbing out of a canyon, I might jump from one ridge to another ridge, turn back to another ridge just to stay in the lift. And it's doable. I flew a little tiny 90-horse Cessna around for years back there doing it. And you just got to be careful, go light, and really work it. Really think about and be conscious of where you're going to find lift and where you're going to find downdrafts, and use the former and stay out of the latter. Okay, well, that brings us to the next sort of subject, which is solar lift. Lift is good in the mountainous terrains. If you're trying to come in and land, it's not good. I've come into a valley and tried to descend and had to go to the other side of the valley because there was too much lift. But in general, lift is good when you're trying to climb. And then when you take, I'm going to take solar lift, and then I'm going to combine the solar and orographic lift. So let's look at that. We'll start out with something easy. If you're trying to climb out of somewhere and you want to use the lift, which side would you fly on? Well, the obvious is the sunny side. The sun's been beating on the rocks most of the morning and heating them up, so you're going to get thermal lift here. You might not necessarily have downdrafts here, but you could certainly have what we call dead air in the shadows and over a river. But here's what's interesting. This is a demarcation line. This is the line between the shadow and the light. So if you're crossing that line, you're probably going to have a little wind shear or turbulence because you're going from up or rising air to possibly sinking air. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to put that in context when we're doing, like say, an approach or departure. Now, I talked about combining them. Let's look at that. Again, which side? Well, if you're looking just at solar lift, maybe you'd want to be over here if you're trying to go climbing out of the canyon. Keep in mind, though, generally, when you're in a canyon like this, you want to fly down the right side because somebody coming the other way is going to be on their right side, so you can pass each other. If you're both trying to climb out and looking for lift, then you might be in each other's face, and that might just be, what happens. And of course, the canyons aren't straight. You got dark, you got bright, you got dark, so you might just have some up and down, up and down. Now let's add a little wind to it. Okay, fine. Well, we looked already earlier at orographic effects that with a little wind, you're probably going to have the downdraft on the downwind side and the updraft on the upwind side. This is a situation where it actually amplifies the solar effect, because now you've got sun heating and also updraft here, creating more lift. You've got the dark area and the downdraft creating more sink. Okay, fine. Let's give it some more wind. Now you notice I'm not actually putting numbers on this. I'm doing that on purpose because I'm not going to sit here and say fly at this number or that number, and then somebody goes out and says, oh, that didn't work for me. But it's interesting because what I found, you start adding more wind, you can actually get a reversed effect. Whoops. And this, actually, a guy named Fletcher Anderson, he's passed away now. He was in Colorado, but he wrote a book years ago called Flying the Mountains. And he did a nice job of describing this at a more macro, larger scale. But I've seen this in the canyons at a much smaller scale, just like this, where you've got enough wind aloft that it's strong enough that it doesn't dip down. It actually will blow right across the canyon, hit the other side, and do this, what's called a reverse flow. Now you've got a mess because the solar lift's trying to push you up. You get this reverse flow. You think that's going to be the updraft side, but it really is the downdraft side. You think this is going to be the downdraft side, but it really is the updraft side. And one of the lessons you might have to figure out there as well, should I really even be there at that point? Which is a good question. Now let's take this a little further. Let's look at in the context you're going to do a takeoff or landing or takeoff at an airstrip in a canyon. There's actually two airstrips here. This is a private airstrip, and this is a U.S. Forest Service airstrip, pretty close together, but they're down in this relatively deep canyon. Some of these shadows here are from the clouds, I can tell in this photo. But the point is, how are we going to use the solar and possibly orographic lift, and how's the wind going to affect if we're going to go in and land or take off there? The orientation, this is north, this is south this way, so it's a north-south orientation. So what that means is the east-facing slopes are going to get a lot of sun in the mornings, and you're probably going to have shadow or dark on this side. I'm going to show you from a little lower altitude. That's the Forest Service strip. You can't quite see the private strip, but it's right there. So there you go. You've got the sun beating on these rocks on this side, which is going to create updrafts and thermal lift. You possibly have down air or sinking air, and definitely over a river you will. If you're going to come in and land, say, at this airstrip, usually I come across here and do a base turn and come in, and I'm trying to fly a stabilized approach, and I got my airplane set up, but I'm already thinking about it. When I circled and assessed the airstrip, I think, you know what? I might have some updrafts here. Then I might have some downdrafts. Then I might turn on the base and have some updrafts. And then I might have downdrafts over the river, and then updrafts and downdrafts. So the point is you've thought about that ahead of time so that when you get into that situation where you're trying to fly a precise airspeed and a stabilized approach, you're anticipating these changes from up to down and up to down, and also crossing that shadow line so that you can be ready for them. Be ready for them and add a little power before you get there so that you don't have to fight it and destabilize your approach. I'll show you a picture looking towards us. The next picture is taken from right about there. This airplane actually just took off from that private strip. And the question there is, we're just taking off. We're trying to climb out. Where do we go? Well, if there's no wind blowing, the obvious would be over on the sunny side, which is not the right side, which normally you might take just for traffic rules. I'm going to go over to the left side, catch that thermal lift, and then maybe I'll switch sides of the canyon when I get a little higher. Okay, so a lot of times how you fly the departure or the approach depends not just on the wind, but also on this concept of, thermal activity and lift, down air, turbulence around the boundaries, etc. Here's another quick example. This is also a north-south oriented strip. This side then gets a lot of sun in the morning. This strip's uphill, so you take off, you land this way uphill, take off this way downhill. Also, you have these little what we call hogbacks. So if there's wind, it can be kind of swirling around in there. But for the takeoff, which is what I'm going to show you, notice it'd be real tempting to just come down the creek here because it's lower terrain. This is a little different time of day, in fact, earlier in the morning, and you can see what I was talking about with the shadows. You go circle the strip and you go, okay, when I'm taking off, I'm going to have shadows here. I got sun over here. There's the final approach. You can see there's really not a go around on this strip. You're going to do what we call abort planning, decide when you need to abort the approach on that strip. And once you turn into final, there's really not a good chance of it because it's a high density altitude and it's rising terrain. So there you can see it's pretty steep terrain coming in behind. There I am coming in for landing. So now I'm going to take off. This is the view down the strip, except for the dog. I don't want to hit him. He's usually in the plane. But again, there's that temptation because it's lower terrain to go down the creek there. But the reality is I've already thought about it and planned ahead. And if there's not any wind blowing, which way do I go? I'm going to go right over against that hill where the sun's been shining on it all morning and catch the thermal lift. And I'm going to stay away from this lower area because there's the darker, possibly sinking air. There's a creek. There might be little eddies and currents, and I'll probably get better climb performance just coming right over here against the side of the hill. So that's what this airplane, we're taking off, just showing you that. Again, you get airborne and you can see that hill out there. He's doing a good job here. Just put the nose down a little, gain some airspeed. There's really no obstacles to clear. And then once we got some good airspeed, just going to go right over against the side of the hill here, stay away from this possible turbulence and wind shear down here. Even with a little bit of wind blowing, you can get some bad air. Stick up against the side of the hill, catch the thermal lift because we're climbing out to go up canyon, and it all works out. How close do you need to get? Well, pretty doggone close usually in order to catch that lift. A couple wingspans maybe, and that's fine. It also gives you more room to turn in the canyon if something happened and you had to turn back. Also, there's another airstrip down around the corner here, and we don't want to be out in the middle of the canyon and have a conflict with somebody taking off from that airstrip. Okay, one more on those combinations. This is a little bit different. The ones I just showed you were north-south orientation, so you had, pretty obvious sun slope shade in that time of morning. This is a little different because this is looking east-west. Now, something that you can keep in mind, and it's a good tool to have, is that the north-facing slopes are just darker. There was actually a little fire in here that burned some of the trees a few years ago, but generally the north-facing slopes will be darker. They'll have more trees because in the northern hemisphere, especially at the higher latitudes, they just don't get as much sun. So you got darker area here, and then you got the south-facing slope, which is lighter. You can see it's sagebrush, and so that's going to heat up more because the sun just shines on it more. So the key there is you're flying an approach. There's the airstrip right there. Again, it's the same kind of parameters. You want to circle the airstrip ahead of time and look at it and say, well, this is the strip's only about 14 to 1,500 feet long, usable. It's down in a canyon. It's a little bit of a blind approach. So I want to set myself up for success. knowing that I could have potential up and down air, here's coming into final approach. The abort on this one is if it doesn't look good, just keep flying down the river. But this is looking up the strip. Again, there's not a good go around from there. So I'm going to show you a little video, again, approaching in that strip and all the things that are going through my mind. I'm shooting through the windshield again, so you can see the sun creates a bit of an issue. Oh. Let's do this. There we go. So I'm set my plane up, I'm configured, I got my airspeed locked in, I'm on final approach here. I'm going to swing out to this side of the canyon so I can have a larger turn radius, which is always helpful, but that's the bright side. That's where I might have potential updrafts. So I might have to adjust my power setting, change, what I'm doing with the airplane as far as pitch and power. They kind of work together, but I want to make sure I've got my airspeed locked in. Then I'm going to come over to this side of the canyon. Notice there is a lot of interference on the windscreen here, and that's just the way it goes with glare. But I'm going to get all the way on this side to have a larger turn radius because the airport is right around the corner. So now I'm on the dark side. Actually, if I came in here a little earlier in the morning, this is all really dark, but you wouldn't be able to see it in the video. But it's a shadowed area. There's a lot more trees. So I'm anticipating that I might be in a little bit of a sink air here. I might get in a sink over the river. And then as I cross the river, maybe down air, maybe sink, you'll see the airport come into view here in just a second. There it is. I have a little lip that I'm going to cross. And then I go to the bright side. And so I might actually go from dead air to down air to up air with no wind blowing, just from the solar effects. And those are all things that I want to keep in mind and anticipate and be ready for, especially with my power. If I need a little power coming over the river, if I have to change the power setting coming over the slope, and then I can just run it right on. You see the sock's dead there. It's good to go in when there's not a lot of wind. And there we go. All of those things are things I'm going to be thinking about, not only for the landing, but also for the takeoff. Now, that was in no wind. We're talking about solar effects and things like that. What if we had wind? Well, for example, that little lip that I came over, if you got wind blowing, let's say you're landing into a headwind, here's what you're trying to do. But with a little wind blowing, a headwind, here's what's probably going to happen, that you're going to get a downdraft. So you're going to have that sinking air over the water, which you usually do have cooler air over the water, so you don't have the updrafts. And this could keep you from, you could bang right into the slope. The other situation is if you're landing with a tailwind. And you might think, well, why the heck would I land with a tailwind? I was taught never to land with a tailwind. Tailwinds are bad, actually. They really increase your ground speed. They create all kind of other issues. In this case, for example, you're trying to land here and it's going to push you up the strip. So the reality is you don't want to take a whole lot of tailwind into a little short strip like that. But to answer that question, you might choose to land with a tailwind because it's a one-way strip. So if you decide, well, I do want to go in there and I'm okay with the level of risk, you can only go in one way, then that's what you choose to do. But be aware, it's going to push you farther down the strip. And if you're at a high density altitude and your ground speeds are already fast and the tailwind makes it worse, and then it pushes you down the strip, there have been a lot of accidents at that particular strip where people run off the end because they just got pushed off the end. So this is the end of the strip. The other point is now we're going to take off. This is what I was getting at earlier in the morning. You got a lot of shadow on that. That's where I flew that approach coming in. In fact, at certain times of day on the strip, the sun will be right there. And I won't even take off if the shadow's in the wrong place because I'm just blinded. And you've got to make about a 90 to 120 degree turn up river in a relatively narrow canyon. So it's just not a good idea. I just wait for the sun, to change, wait for the earth to move. In no wind, again, you're going to have a little sink over the river, go to the shadow side, maybe have a little down air. But let's say you're taking off with a headwind. Well, that canyon, this is not as steep, but it's still terrain in this diagram. What's going to happen is you start to climb and there might be a downdraft coming down that hill. So it's going to push you right into that hill. A lot of times people say, oh, I was taught to take off in the wind. That's great, but what's out past it? Because if you got terrain out here and you're taking off in the wind, cleared the trees, and then down you go because of the downdrafts over the terrain. Likewise, taking off with a tailwind, Same kind of thing. If it's a one-way strip, you might decide to go ahead and take off. That's your choice based on, you've assessed the hazard, which in this case is a possibility of being dunked in the river. And you decide, okay, I'm okay with that. You decide to do it. Well, these are the kind of things you have to be aware of in order to mitigate that risk. Another thing you can do is just wait, right? Just wait it out. The wind's going to die eventually. Tailwinds are just not a very smart thing in a lot of cases, because it doesn't take a whole lot of tailwind. Like in the Cessna book, 2 knots of tailwind increases your speed or ground roll by 10%, just 2 knots, which is nothing. So again, tailwinds are a whole different deal, but I put that in there because that's something you want to consider when you're considering what the risks are. Okay, so we've looked at orographic solar combinations, a little bit more about those combinations of lift. This is out of our book. This is interesting. And it's kind of cartoonish, but what it shows is that if you've got the winds aloft blowing over, say, a canyon area, you might have a situation where down in the canyon, there's no wind, and you get all this thermal lift. So you're climbing out on this side of the canyon, but when you get up towards the top of the ridge, if the wind's blowing like this, you may actually get into more of a downdraft. So maybe you need to switch sides, come over to the updraft side, right? Conversely, if you're coming along, flying like above and you're descending into the canyon, maybe you think you're going to have a downdraft, but then you get into an updraft. Increase the wind a little bit. What I've actually seen a lot, quite honestly, is you get, like, it'll be real warm down in this canyon or hot, and you get the rising air. And so that creates like a cushion, and the winds aloft aren't able to scoop down into the canyon quite as much, but you get a wind shear here because you've got these different, it's like any wind shear where you've got different air masses. This is more of a smaller scale, but same thing. You got this rising thermally heated air. You've got this maybe more stable air, and so you get a boundary between them. And then finally, you increase the wind more, and the question you should be asking yourself is, why the heck am I even here, right? There have been a lot of times when I remember when I was flying Part 135, where we'd come into an airstrip that we flew into a lot, and you'd start down into that canyon and you were getting all beat up. Just, it's like, oh my gosh, well, I think I'll just skip off and go to my next place and maybe come back later. Or conversely, if you're climbing out, it's all nice and hot and it's still, and then you get into that stuff, well, maybe you just want to turn around and go back. That again goes into your fuel planning. Do you have enough fuel to be able to make these kind of decisions, divert, fly around for a little while, or, on the ground, it's easier because you just sit there and wait. Okay, well, let's look at a couple other things. Diurnal winds is a fun one, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how those might affect your flight planning and operations. Convergence effects, and then unconnected drainages, which is an interesting one. So let's dive right in. This is out of the FAA Flying Handbook. Diurnal effects, diurnal just means daily. Probably the most well-studied one is the sea breeze, land breeze, right? You get, or this in this case is the valley breeze, mountain breeze. And what happens is in the daytime, the valley air will heat up more rapidly, so it'll start to rise up the mountain range, and that'll create kind of a circulation pattern. So you get uphill flow, up mountain flow. It's called a valley breeze. And then in the nighttime, you get what's called a mountain breeze, because the mountain cools off faster, the air is more dense, it flows downslope and creates kind of a reverse circulation. The names kind of seem weird based on what's actually happening, but just remember in the daytime, things flow upslope, and at nighttime, they'll flow downslope. So that's a daily change. This little cartoon from the FAA is showing a mountain, but a canyon will actually amplify that effect. This is Hell's Canyon down, kind of downstream from the Salmon River. This is, I used to call it the deepest canyon in North America, but Mike Vivian corrected me. It's the deepest canyon in the lower 48. And if you want to know where the deepest canyon is, you'll have to ask Mike. But the point being, if you've got a big elevation change between the lower end of the canyon and hundreds of miles away, it's higher, you'll get these upslope valley winds up the canyon in the daytime and then down the canyon at night. And it's just a big ditch. It's a conduit. And so you can get some fierce winds in these canyons because it channels that diurnal wind. The other thing I want to combine with that is something we call a convergence effect. This is the Salmon River. second deepest canyon in the lower 48. And this is one of its tributaries coming in. And so a very deep canyon, you'll get those diurnal winds flowing upstream along about mid-morning, but sometimes you still have a downstream nighttime wind on the tributary canyon. So you got a big mess. And guess what? There's an airstrip right here. There's another airstrip right here. In fact, I used to fly for the company that supplied this airstrip right here. And so I went in and out of that airstrip a lot. And I can tell you these upstream winds, and when I was river guiding on this river too, we'd be trying to row down the river and you can't even make it because of the wind. But you get a lot of crazy winds in here because the convergence effect, especially if you got the diurnal wind coming in opposite directions, just creating a big mess. Okay, so that's something to look at when you're studying the chart or the terrain ahead of time, or even just flying overhead and looking at the terrain. If you have these convergence and these rivers coming together, it can create havoc when you have much wind blowing. So I got a little story about that, actually. This is back on the middle fork of the Salmon River, and the river actually flows to the north. This is the main river drainage. The total river, this is only about half of it on the chart. It's 104 miles long, and the difference in elevation is almost 3,000 feet between one end and the other. So you get these really pretty significant diurnal upstream winds along in, starting about mid-morning. And then at night, you'll get the downstream. The thing is, though, you have all these tributaries coming into it. One of them is Indian Creek. If you can see this here, it's in blue. So what's interesting, and there's an airstrip right here, is you'll get the upstream diurnal wind on the main river, but this is a nice, pretty high terrain. There might still be some snow on it. So you'll get that downstream or downflow wind. And this is a picture of the strip. This is looking back to the south. This is Indian Creek right here coming into the main drainage. There's a windsock here, and there's a windsock there. And I've seen them just going in opposite directions because you've got that upstream wind on the main river and that downstream wind on the tributary. And then there's a little hog back here. It'll flow over that. And you're coming in on final approach if you're landing this way. And it's just a big mess. Fortunately, it's a big long runway, so you can go over the top of that and land further down. But it can get really kind of crazy windy in there. This is looking back downstream to the north. That last picture was taken from right about there. And it's interesting. I was in there. I usually go in for a camping trip every June for 3 or 4 nights, and it's a beautiful area. So there I was in my little airplane, and we got down. This is actually where, like I said earlier, this was the first place I ever flew into in a little airplane. This is the boat ramp, and it's pretty crowded here in low water because all the rafters are there setting up their camp or their river trips. But we're down there setting up our tent, and it's a beautiful little spot, like I said, and got all set up. Then I walked back up top, up the boat ramp, and there are a bunch of airplanes there. Okay, cool. These guys were kind of milling around, and they'd never been in there. A couple of them had, I think, and they were camped a couple canyons over. And so we're all kind of hanging out there. And then the wind picked up. This picture is before the wind picked up. But when the wind picked up, along about 11 o'clock or so, what happened was these guys all started coming over. Like I said, my plane was parked right there, and they saw that I was there. So they came over and started asking me questions. Questions were, wow, should we take off? Because by then the sock was pretty much full sock, blowing back and forth. This sock was doing one thing. This sock over here that I was saying about was doing another thing. This is Indian Creek coming in. They're like, should we take off? Well, first of all, I'm not going to tell somebody what to do in that situation. But what I do is I just started asking them questions, right? In fact, one of them pulled out his aeronautical chart, and we looked at it. And I pointed out what I was showing you earlier. I said, well, here's the main canyon, and there's this canyon, and you got all these conflicting winds, and there's a whole bunch of questions. First of all, how well did you study the terrain when you were coming in here? Because if you take off this way, you got to make a right turn. Taking off this way, there's actually another strip that's not on the chart right there. So I just started asking them questions. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, but actually, if you look in chapter 5 of our book, there's a whole bunch of discussion on them, but one of them is the time of day. Is it late enough that the density altitude is high enough that's going to decrease your performance? What about sometimes a day at this airstrip you take off and you turn down canyon and the sun's right in your face? What about the shape of the runway, the surface, any hazards? Are there animals, equipment, human activity, any other airplanes? These are things you should have actually assessed before you ever went in there. The wind, the gradient, the surrounding the terrain, the obstacles. Again, you can study this stuff ahead of time. And even when we call it sussing out the airstrip, you circle and you look and you say, well, how's the wind going to affect what I do after departure? Is it uphill or downhill? Is there any other terrain? Do I have to turn down a canyon? What are the obstacles? Also, something you want to do before you go into an airstrip is plan your approach and also your departure. You want to plan your departure before you ever go in, because in some cases you get down there and it's not really obvious how to get out. And that's, a couple of the guys realized that. They'd done a pretty good job of planning their approach. Obviously, they were there and everything was fine, but they hadn't thought about their departure. This is actually a Google Earth image, which may show it a little better than the chart. There's the strip. And they hadn't really looked at it. They said, oh, I'll come in and land, but then what's upstream? What's downstream? After departure, you clear the trees. There might be some turbulence. If the wind is squirrely, you have to make this right turn down the river. There have been fatal crashes of people turning up the wrong canyon. Years ago, there was a DC-3, killed everybody on board that went up there. So the key there is, did you plan your departure before you went in? But people are, nowadays, I think there's a lot of information out there where they say, yeah, I'm going to plan my approach and here's where I abort based on my altitude and the parameters, et cetera. But they kind of forget that you need to plan your departure before you go in. Another thing is, again, your takeoff and landing performance. How heavy are you? How hot is it? Is the wind going to affect it like those figures we were looking at earlier? Are you climbing into a headwind towards terrain? Maybe you'll have a downdraft. What's your climb performance? What's your abort plan? Maybe you had an abort plan for landing, because that's really what you should do, is say, hey, at this altitude or this position, I'm either committed to land or I'm not. That's what we call abort point planning or flying. I find a lot of people are pretty good at that, but they haven't thought about aborting for takeoff. Now, you can do that while you're circling the airstrip up above, is look at the airstrip and go, oh, I got to make a turn down canyon, or I got to clear some obstacles. So if I'm not off by a certain point on that airstrip, I'm probably not going to make it. You can also do it on the airstrip. I like to walk an airstrip and pick a physical location that I can readily identify and say, if I'm not airborne and climbing in ground effect by that position, I'm going to give it up. And I guarantee you the professional pilots, the Part 135 air taxi pilots, I've seen them abort. My old flight instructor, I was camped at a strip once. He aborted 3 takeoffs and ended up just spending the day there because it was stupid to try to take off. But he had an abort plan. Finally, it's, what are your emergency landing spots? Once you get airborne, what if something happens? In our little airplanes that we fly in GA, probably the time your engine's going to quit is right after you pour the power to it, right? It's been sitting, you give it power, boom. So they ended up all making a pretty good decision. I thought they just hung out for the day because it was really windy. I wasn't going to tell them what to do, but by the time I gave them all these questions to ask themselves, led them through this decision-making process. They hadn't come together, by the way. It was just some random guys from here and there. And they all said, hey, it's probably just a better idea to stay. So they hung out by the river and went for hikes and had a great day. So the point I'm making there is, a lot of times it's the questions that you ask yourself that about, what are the hazards? What are the risks? Can I eliminate them? If not, can I mitigate them? And if not, well, maybe I just don't want to do it. This is something I mentioned. I've talked about convergence effects and things coming together. Well, this is something completely different. It's what I call unconnected drainages. A little story there too. Years and years and years ago, I was camped at this airstrip right here, Johnson Creek. I know it was years ago because I had my little Cessna 120. And I got up in the morning and thought, well, I'll just go on up to Big Creek to the lodge for breakfast. Beautiful day, about 6 in the morning, not a bump in the sky, not a cloud in the sky. I took off, I'm climbing up here, smooth as silk air. And right as I got over the ridge here, I got kind of bumped around and then it was smooth again. Came in, I noticed a little bit, my altimeter looked a little funky, but you don't really need any of your instruments when you come in to fly if you just do it visually. So I came in and landed. And when I got on the ground, I checked my altimeter and it was like 250 feet off. I had set it at the correct elevation at here, but when I got to my destination, it was wrong. I'm thinking, well, wow, that's weird. These airports are really close together. Well, then I started studying the chart and I realized, I think I know what's going on. This is a drainage system where this river, Big Creek, comes into this river, it comes into this river. These all drain that way. I was down here at Johnson Creek, which is actually in a completely different drainage system. It drains into the East Fork of the South Fork and the South Fork and eventually into that river. But the point being, what I did was I crossed a divide. I crossed a drainage divide, and that would be right about here. So when I found that kind of bump, 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 and going over the ridge, that was when I went from one pressure system to another pressure system. Okay, that's what the divide is. So even in a very short distance, I had a very different pressure system. And then so sometimes, you can get fog in one area and not in another, or different wind patterns and different pressure patterns. Nowadays, you have all the fancy stuff where, it corrects. And of course, ADSB sometimes works or not. But one of the main hazards with that is, what if somebody had taken off from here heading my way, and I take off from here heading their way, and both of us have altimeters that are off, and we're making position reports? Well, the easy thing there is just ask them what their altimeter setting is, right? So if you did take off in different pressure systems, you can figure it out. That's kind of an interesting little phenomenon. Well, we're going to wrap up here with a couple more little tidbits about different kinds of things you might find: mechanical turbulence, and finally something called Venturi effect, or it's also called gap winds. A mechanical turbulence, it can be common anywhere. You get it everywhere. It's not just in a mountainous area. In fact, this is from weather.gov, and they show, hangars and buildings and anything can create mechanical turbulence. The thing that creates it most commonly in backcountry environments are trees. Here's an example of a strip. This is actually just outside of Seattle by the freeway. It's in a relatively deep canyon. It's not real narrow, but it's relatively deep, and it's completely surrounded by trees. This is looking back towards Seattle to the west. We'll turn around and look back the other way to the east. You can see some pretty high terrain, but these are pretty tall trees. It was kind of a funny story I tell on myself. I've been flying in Idaho for years, and I just fly and land over the trees. And the first time I came to the Washington Cascades to come into one of these little strips, it wasn't this one, it was a different one. I thought, I'll just go in and land over the trees. And as I got down closer, I'm like, dang, those are tall trees. Because in Washington, they got these big, huge Douglas firs, and they're like twice as tall as the Idaho trees. So the tall trees can create even more of this mechanical turbulence, but be aware, go to a different area, you might have those different trees. Here we are on the ground. Again, it's pretty good terrain there, but you got these big tall trees. This is looking back towards Seattle to the west. The key there is the mechanical turbulence. It can get pretty doggone strong. And what I found, and what probably a lot of you have too, you might have a couple different situations. Sometimes, for example, let's say you're landing into a headwind. You're landing into a headwind and it's pretty steady, and then you drop below treetop level and it goes away. Well, you've had a nice stabilized approach, and then boom, the bottom drops out. The opposite of that I've seen is you'll have pretty smooth, calm air, but then, or maybe a little wind, and when you drop below tree level, you get rotors and turbulence. And sometimes you can't predict it. So this mechanical turbulence is something that's not as predictable, but you want to be aware. And, when you're assessing the situation, say, well, maybe it can get pretty windy in there, and I want to think twice about my approach, or if I'm really going to take off. Now, this is looking, again, down the strip. I want to show you a little video. This video, I actually drove in here on the day I took the video because it's pretty doggone windy. But I want you to watch the sock and the trees. So in a matter of only a few seconds, I'm just pan over the strip here just to show you the strip. You can see the trees. If you can see the video very well, the trees, tops of the trees are moving. Hopefully it's not skipping for you. But watch this sock and watch the trees. In a matter of only a few seconds, the sock's going to go out, drops limp, although we still got wind in the trees. It's going to go up again. And then in a minute, we're going to get a little gust, boom, and we get almost about 120-degree change in direction, a velocity change. Here are the trees, just boom, here comes a gust through there. Imagine hitting that right as you're taking off or right as you're landing. So mixing the wind like that in these kind of environments can be a bit of a hazard, quite honestly. This is from ntsb.gov, and I point this out because let's say you get a weather forecast and you're going into the mountainous area and you say, light turbulence, not a big deal. I fly in light turbulence all the time. Okay, fine, but the definition of light turbulence is that it can cause airspeed fluctuations of almost 15 knots and derived gusts of up to like almost 1,200 feet per minute. And so the key there is, wow, what if I'm on final approach and I'm flying it at, my whatever speed, 40, 50, 60, in a Super Cub is going to be slower than in a Cessna, for example. But if you get a tailwind gust, you're doing, say, 55 or 60 knots, and you get a tailwind gust of even 15 knots, that can stall your airplane. Or a drive gust, a downdraft, there's no way you're going to shove the power to it and outclimb this kind of downdraft. And that's just with light turbulence. Moderate turbulence is even worse. So the point I make there is you shouldn't take the winds lightly. I think that's been kind of a theme throughout this whole presentation is, wind, it can be your friend if you're using it to your advantage, but it can also create a bunch of problems, takeoffs, landings, climb outs, en route. In this case, turbulence, downdrafts, etc. Now, what's interesting about this particular strip, one of the things that actually drives that wind is the next subject we're going to talk about, because you're looking back up canyon to the east here, it goes around and there's a gap right here. It's called Snoqualmie Pass. And they get nasty, terrible weather in there. But what happens is you get the wind coming from behind us off the Pacific coast, and the winds aloft are flowing to the west. You funnel it through a gap like this, or one like Snoqualmie Pass, which is actually right here. It's on the chart. So there's the strip, comes around the corner, comes through the pass, and it can greatly accelerate that wind. And that's what's called a venturi, or a gap wind is what it's known. So you have colder air here for whatever reason. It could be because it's at a higher mountain range, or it could be air mass, or it could be coming off a water body. But you might have lighter winds, but as it's accelerated through this venturi, just like a venturi in your carburetor, it accelerates the winds and you get much stronger winds. You can also get downdrafts on this side. You can get horizontal wind shear. You can get vertical wind shear, and it can be a big mess. So these venturis are something that you really want to watch for. And you can study say an aeronautical chart or Google Earth. Here's one, for example. I just randomly picked an area right here. I'm looking, if you can see my pointer, Coulter Pass in Montana. You got pretty good sized mountain range. It's pretty high. You got a narrowing and a gun sight pass, they call it. And so you can get some really high winds in there. And on the downwind side, which is usually this side, a lot of downdrafts, turbulence. If you're coming at it from this side, that could be a real problem, because you might not be able to outclimb it and you could end up impacting the terrain. Again, you can find these things on charts. Here's one of the biggest ones in the West Coast is the Columbia River Gorge. It's perfect. It's the whole Cascade Range has a leak, basically. It's the wind surfing capital of the world for a reason. In the winter, you've got the higher pressure, colder air here on the east. You've got the warmer maritime air. And so it flows through this venturi and increases. And I used to be based out of this airport right here, and you get howling winds. But about 5 miles either side, there's no wind, because the wind just screams through here and then it comes out of the gorge and just dissipates. In the summer, this high desert over here out in Oregon and Washington heats up. You get thermal expansion. You get a lower pressure. This is higher pressure, so the winds reverse. So you get east winds in the winter, west winds in the summer. So that's a real large example of a venturi. You can also see it on a smaller scale. This is an example from the Washington Cascades. Again, you got this real high terrain, colder air. So you'll get a downslope flow. The winds aloft typically come from this direction as well. They'll be funneled through this canyon, the Titan River Canyon. It's a relatively narrow canyon. Even at this strip here, which I'm going to show you, you can see there's a big rock and there's a venturi right there, which actually will accelerate it. So at this airstrip, Titan State, you can see, you come up and land. Usually you land uphill this way. You can land downhill. But this is a venturi right here, like I showed you on the chart. You got those winds that coming across. They're being accelerated through the larger canyon, and they're accelerated right through here. That's another picture of a little closer in. It's kind of uphill here. Question is, would I take off that way? Well, no. I mean, even in a headwind, I wouldn't, because it's uphill. I'd have downdrafts, and then I'd get into that Venturi. In fact, there have been accidents at this strip for people doing that exact thing, trying to do, say, a go around, and getting sucked into that Venturi and down and hit the downdrafts and just pushed them into the ground. This is looking down the strip. It's a bit of a slope at the end, and then that's looking back up the strip. But again, these are things that you can tell before you even get on the ground just by studying the chart. Google Earth is actually a great tool. And when you circle the strip before you go into land, look for these kind of things. Where are these things going to happen? Do I have a narrowing of a canyon? Like right here on the strip, you can see that's going to be a downdraft. If I'm taking off this way into a headwind, there's going to be a downdraft. So I might choose to go the other way with a little bit of tailwind, and that might be okay because it's downhill and I've got a little lake and I can just climb out. So that goes back to that original set of parameters that that I mentioned of you have hazards, perceived hazards, you have risk, you want to see if you can mitigate that risk and make good decisions. Sometimes the best decision is just either not to land or not to take off. Okay, so we've talked about wind shear. We talked about turbulence. We looked at orographically produced up and down drafts, how to use them to your advantage, how to stay out of the downdrafts. We looked at solar lift. We looked at sinking air in the shadows or over the water. We looked at how sun and wind can be in opposition, creating more problems for you. Also, we looked at you can have turbulence and abrupt changes between light to shadow when you say flying your approach, like where you're flying over the dark to the light. Wooded to bare terrain we looked at, over water, over lakes, over rivers. We looked at confluences, convergence effects. We looked at ridges separating unconnected canyons or drainages. We looked at mechanical turbulence. We looked at Venturi effects, gap winds, a lot of stuff here. Like I said, it's pretty fast paced, but hopefully, some things that you can think about and apply. And that's the key there. Actually, I got a little ahead of myself. You can apply these things. And I wanted to prove that to a group Mike Vivian and I were giving some talks for AOPA a couple of years ago at some of their fly-ins. And we were in Carbondale, Illinois. I remember this. And I just gone through a similar talk. And I give exercises to the students in my classes and put them on a chart somewhere and say, where are you going to find all these things? And so I just hold myself to the same standard. So when we were there in Carbondale, I looked for an area and I found this airport in the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. Actually, it's called Johnson County Airport in Mountain City, Tennessee. I thought, well, I've never been to that airport, but I should be able to use these tools that I'm teaching. So let's take a look at it. Well, okay, we got this linear feature, the Appalachian Mountains. This is a long valley. It's surrounded by these ridges. And I've pulled off the internet a picture. This is looking back down to the southwest. So looking this way down the valley. And then this is looking back the other way. It's definitely surrounded by some high mountains. And you got that kind of narrow valley. Then I thought, well, I wonder where the prevailing winds come from there. In the West Coast, they mostly come out of the west and southwest, because it could determine what I want to do, or what I'm figuring out could happen as far as wind and orographic effects and Venturi effects at this airport, right? Because again, you got this kind of narrow valley, you got a little gap here, which could potentially create a Venturi right there. So I did a little research and I found out that in this particular area, you get what are called extratropical cyclones, mid-latitude cyclones. The weatherman just called them a low pressure system. If you studied meteorology, they rotate counterclockwise and they move kind of across the country like this. And so what happens in this area is you get that counterclockwise flow. And so you end up getting prevailing winds scooping around and coming in from the southeast. They draw in this moisture from the Atlantic Ocean. You get upslope flow onto the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, that ends up being the wetter side because you bring this moisture in. And so you get these winds often that are out of the south or southeast. What that means is they're going to come across this ridge right here, create downdrafts here, updrafts here. But this is the key right here over Mountain City. You can see it better on the Google Earth image. Here come these winds. Here's the airport. And this Venturi will accelerate those winds. And so my guess, just based on my studying of the chart and the Google Earth and the local weather patterns, is that you might get some screaming winds across this airport, either right up the runway or possibly crosswinds that are then accelerated as they come through this Venturi. So I just threw that out there. And it turns out there in Carbondale were a couple of people at the seminar that had actually flown out of this airport. In fact, one guy went out in and out of there a lot. And he said, yeah, that's exactly what happens. So the point is, these are tools that you can use to help you assess any situation that you're going into and out of. Even though you don't have to have somebody tell you this is exactly what happens. You want to develop those skills that you can use and take anywhere. I was talking earlier today to someone. I said, when I give somebody backcountry instruction, my goal is that once we're done, they don't need me anymore because they're developing their skill set and their decision-making ability. But when it comes to weather and these things that we've been talking about, really what I can offer is the only thing I can offer is that the only constant is that it's going to constantly be changing. So I'm a college professor. That means I have to give you a quiz before we go. Mm-hmm. So here's the quiz. How do you know when you're a backcountry pilot? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, if you can fly to the party, or if you can bring your airplane right to the party, mm-hmm. or if your tie down consists of a stump and a backhoe, or if you actually have to use that duct tape that you keep in your toolkit, then you probably are a backcountry pilot, maybe legitimately. Had to show another Super Cub because we are on supercub.org. Dick and I, again, posing with our, and if you didn't catch it early, if you didn't come in, we do have a book that's been out for a couple years. I've been sharing with you actually mostly from chapter 2 of our book. There's a whole lot of information in there. And it's not just Amy and Dick. We had some guest authors. In fact, Paul Klaus, who was on here earlier, was a contributor. Mike Vivian was a major contributor to the book. We have chapters on how to prepare, things you can practice, how to figure out, what power settings and air speeds you want to use in your different parts of flying, your approaches. And 2 of the chapters are all about takeoffs and landings. We've got a whole chapter on density, altitude, and performance. The very last chapter in the book is actually all about aeronautical decision-making, which I've been throwing in here quite a bit. So hopefully that's been helpful. And if you want more, there's always more out there. And I agree with Rod Machado, who actually wrote the introduction to our book. He just said everybody should have one. So of course we agree with him, but it was a labor of love. We spent almost 2 years working on this and going into the literature, and hopefully it's something that'll help people. It's fun too, because not only is it technical, it's interspersed with stories, and stories not just from Dick and I, but from a bunch of other people. So one of the things I want to finally leave people with, and this is my philosophy, is there's always more to learn. I've been teaching flying for 30 something years, teaching backcountry flying for 30 years. I certainly don't know everything. I'm always learning every time I fly. And even if it starts to get stale, there's other ways you can learn. In fact, a couple years ago, my friend Bob Hanna, who owns Northwest Backcountry, called me up and said, go get your floats. So now I'm learning a whole new set of skills, because I put these floats on my little Scout, like I said, 2 years ago, and I'm having a blast. And quite honestly, I'm having fun because a lot of the skills are transferable, from backcountry flying to float flying, from a lot of the boating I did. And so that's what I leave, I can leave people with, is there's always more to learn. Get out there, do the best you can, seek, whatever resources you can. Hopefully it's been helpful, and thanks for your time.
Amy, that was fantastic. Not just helpful, but fantastic. Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So do we have any questions, folks? We have some people clapping and things like that. Anybody have any questions about anything? It was just very thorough, as you said it would be. All right. Well, the YouTube will remain out there, folks. And thanks for that comment. You got the comment, a veritable 2-legged encyclopedia.
Tom Donnelly's in our book, by the way. His picture's in our book, his foot.
So Mike Vivian he was on here earlier. He never chimed in and told us what that deepest mountain range was.
Yeah, you'll have to ask him later.
But folks, we've streamed all this stuff to YouTube, and So if you want to go back and watch it later and have any additional questions, their book is fantastic. I told Amy I must admit that I did not read it cover to cover yet, but I have referred to it many times, and certainly a book everybody wants to have. Amy, somebody want to know what your URL is again for your website?
Yeah, it's really easy. It's canyonflying.com. All one word, canyonflying.com. You could put that in the chat, or I could put it in the chat, or you can put it in the chat.
I can do that. Canyon flying. Oops. If I could spell it. There we go. Very good. Well, thanks so much for your time, Amy. This was fantastic. Very much appreciate it. And I know, especially since you spend all day teaching, it's great for you to take the time for us tonight to teach us a little bit. And appreciate everybody that was here this evening. Quite a good group. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Next week, again, is George Campbell's going to talk about doing some float flying. And we've got a pretty good lineup coming up in the next few months, too. So hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thank you again, Amy Hoover. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, and Steve, I would say thank you for doing this. I know it's hard for everybody being stuck at home, and I think it's a really great venue. And I've watched a few of them, some great information on there. So thanks for setting it all up.
Well, I'm just trying to keep pilots out of the bars. That's been my goal. And, I don't know if it's working or not, but so, anyway, thank you all very much. Good night.